you had for years actually worked in a, say, domestic violence charity for trans victims of domestic violence, or an immigration or asylum charity helping illegal immigrants, if you've done that silently for years and nobody knows about it, what's the point? And in fact, if you're like a middle-class cis-het white guy who does all that, well, the world would consider you to be just another middle-class cis-het white guy. They wouldn't know about your years of solitary service helping people. So this is it. The whole point is to be seen to be doing something, to partake in this pastime and hobby. It's exactly the same way that, people who say support certain football team, they'll put it in their bio on social media. They want people to know about it. It's really important to them. They don't just want to sit by themselves or, in a stadium or watching TV supporting their team. They want everyone to know that they support their team, because that's half the point. And it's the same with what I call Leftwing Hobbyists.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro, and with me is Ricky Orpak. Ricky, would you consider yourself a leftist stooge?
No, I would not.
Oh, well, okay. Well, that's good. That's good.
I consider myself politically homeless, is what I consider.
Oh, I was going to say, are you alt-right?
That does sound cool. It does sound a bit rock and roll, but I don't really know what it is.
Well, we don't know what these terms mean. We don't even know, how class and race and age and sex factor into all these things. So we've lined up David Swift. He's going to sort it all out for us. I'm confident at the end of this that you'll have a better handle on what you're doing. But first, you always know we tell you the truth here at the New Flesh Podcast, and the truth is we need your help. We need you to leave us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show. We read all the reviews, so post away. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about the show. A great place to get in touch with us, a guaranteed response. And finally, please tell your friends about the show. If they don't like it, I don't know. Dump them. All right? On with the show.
David Swift is a historian and writer specialising on the contemporary left. He has published in a broad range of academic journals and taught at various universities in the UK and overseas. David's books include Left for Itself, Leftwing Hobbyists and Performative Radicalism, and most recently, The Identity Myth, Why We Need to Embrace Our Differences to Beat Inequality. David, welcome to the New Flesh.
Thanks, lads. Thanks for having me.
Now, fairly recently, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson stepped down as leader of the Tory party and was replaced by Britain's first Prime Minister of Asian heritage, Rishi Sunak. Sections of the left have been obsessed with identity and race for a while now, and I'm interested to know if there was any celebration from identitarians to the fact that Rishi Sunak was elevated to Britain's top job.
Definitely, I would say the short answer is definitely not. No, I think the longer, more complicated answer is there are plenty of people who were sort of saying, okay, let's remark upon this and say it's an achievement, that's an important achievement. But they would also then say, but of course, just because somebody happens to be Asian doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good person or they have good politics or. Their becoming prime minister is a good thing for the country. I think it's definitely complicated certain things, because not only do you have Rishi Sunak as prime minister, you now also have Suella Braverman as home secretary in charge of immigration. She herself is of Asian descent. And again, she's very hostile to immigration. And this really has caused a lot of consternation among certain people who it's maybe showing the need for them to reevaluate their language, really, in the way they talk about race.
Isn't it? It's a strange situation, because I suppose, it seems like the Tories, at least, that they do seem quite to use the left's language diverse in many ways. And so when we get very strange criticism, sometimes you get the feeling as if they're being told, they're not the right ones. It's like, oh, Rishi, you're not the right one. Suella, you're not the right one. And it's like, what do you mean the right one? It's like a bit like that moment in The Office when Brent says, it's the other one. The other what?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, there was a Labour MP, backbench Labour MP, who said something like this about, I think it was Kwasi Kwarteng, who was the short-lived Chancellor. Said he's not really black or something, or it was like, if you listen to or something, you wouldn't think he was black. And actually, the historian David Starkey got into trouble about 10 years ago for saying something from the opposite direction, like talking about in a positive way, actually saying, oh, you wouldn't think he was black to listen to him. And yeah, that's where we are now when you have people sort of from the left saying, oh, yeah, such and such may be black or Asian, but not really. I think we definitely saw a lot of this from certain US commentators after the last presidential election in 2020 when, Trump's vote share went up amongst every ethnic group, apart from white people. Hispanic Americans, Muslim Americans, African Americans, they all had an increased vote share for Trump. And yeah, sure, you have this idea now of political whiteness and how, just because black people might be, just because the color of your skin might be black, if you're a Republican or you support certain policies, you are politically white. In fact, yeah, I just literally yesterday, I think I read in the Atlantic magazine in the US about how, just because you're Hispanic doesn't mean you can't be a white supremacist. Right? This was after a Hispanic killed a load of people in Texas, and they were saying, oh yeah, just because he's Hispanic doesn't mean he can't be a white supremacist. So this is it. I think, as societies become more diverse, like the Tory party has been, it's going to really challenge a lot of certain, lazy assumptions about identity and stuff. Because, yeah, as you get more high-profile right-wing politicians of black or Asian origin, and indeed, as you get more sort of serial killers and terrorists, and white supremacists of different origins, it's really going to challenge a lot of these identitarian assumptions.
Well, perhaps we can we'll circle back to the left, I'm sure, but would you mind talking us through your own personal political journey? Because it's been a very tumultuous time in politics over the last few years. And I think it's interesting to get a sense of how people have navigated this personally, like where you've come from on the political spectrum and perhaps maybe where you feel like you are, not that you need to stay there.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely consider myself to be on the left. I think the left is a pretty broad church, just the same way, conservatism or the right can be a broad church. And I think definitely that somebody like Keir Starmer, the UK Labour leader, even though he certainly feels obliged to pay lip service to certain identitarian shipments, I don't think he believes in them. I think he's surrounded by good people like Claire Ainsley, who wrote this great book on the new working class recently, and people like that really. Even actually, there's a Labour politician called Wes Streeting, and he's the Shadow Health Secretary currently, and he again used to be very pro Stonewall, one of the major LGBT, specifically T charities now in the UK, and he used to be. I mean, he's from the sort of economic right of the party, which is like a young Tony Blair in some ways. And he recently actually was on the radio about a year ago saying, men have penises, women have vaginas, that's the end of it. And I was really pleasantly surprised to hear or see that from him especially, right? Because he traditionally has been more of the sort of double liberals within the Labour Party, and Tony Blair-like on economics, so happy to have free movement of capital and goods and people, but also very liberal on all of their sort of cultural issues. And actually, I think it was encouraging for me to see someone like him make this statement, because he's a very ambitious guy. He wants to succeed Keir Starmer. He wants to be Prime Minister one day. And, for someone like him, who, as I say, in the past has been very close with Stonewall, to make such a statement like that, it's encouraging for me, actually, that there is room in the British Labour Party for more moderate sort of cultural values, if you like, or what used to be called liberal cultural values a few years ago. Even though I'm often associated with the sort of blue Labour movement here in the UK, I suppose I am in some ways a bit of a cultural liberal. My sort of critique of the sort of cultural left within the Labour Party has mostly been around practicality. It's mostly been around saying that, listen, various constituencies that you might consider to be natural supporters of the left, not just the fabled white working class, but also people with black and Asian diverse backgrounds. Very often they are appalled and repelled by some of these attitudes, actually, and intellectual suicide to keep pushing policies like open borders or some of the more radical, abolish the family, abolish the police kind of stuff. So yeah, personally, even though definitely I sort of write a lot about criticizing these sort of excesses of the liberal left, I'm pretty liberal myself still in some ways. Right now I live in Israel, actually. I just said in the UK, I'm actually in Israel, where my wife's from and where she works. And it's interesting here. right? Because Israel is one of the few countries in the world, certainly one of the few developed economies, where they have, an above replacement fertility rate, right? I think the average number of kids here is like 2.7 per couple or something, which is interesting because this is a country where most people are, white, if you like. Obviously, it's debatable whether Jews are truly white, but whatever, that's not for me to say. It's obviously a developed economy, etc. They're pretty liberal in terms of LGBT stuff and things like that. In terms of even smoke weed in the streets, for example, that kind of thing. But again, they're very big on family. They're very big on family. They're very big on like pro-maternal policies as well, right? You can get
But also a bit hawkish as well, like on security.
Well,
So
well,
there's
indeed.
a wonderful marriage of supportive liberal stuff with just this total, I don't know, like SWAT team approach to stuff.
It's weird, yeah. I was at a wedding like a year ago, because you can. I mean, Israel is very strange in many ways. And one of the strange things is often the younger people are more right wing, right? And the adults you get is actually more liberal on the big issue of the place. In many ways, because like the people of 60 years above remember a very different Israel from back in the day when it was much more weaker and vulnerable and much more socialist, etc. In part because younger people, obviously everyone has to go to the army, right? Aged 18 to 21, no excuses, men and women, you're in the military for 3 years. So high school students coming towards graduating high school, they're not talking about, where you're going to go to college or you're going to go traveling. They're going to go, what are you going to do in the army? That's what you have that conversation with young people. And again, I was at a wedding about a year ago, and there's this guy there, big hipster beard, nose ring, stuff like this. We were talking about politics. And he said, I said, he said to me, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a writer about this kind of thing. He said, oh, like Ibram X. Kendi? I went, no, like Ibram X. Kendi.
Exactly like that. Exactly like that. And I commend his paychecks as well. Thank you very much.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I love his royalty pay, absolutely. And then I went, no, actually, I'm quite critical of stuff like that. He went, oh, so like Jordan Peterson. I went, well, I'm not quite sure, it's the two, I'm not necessarily I'm
This
these
doesn't
guys.
sound like very calm wedding talk.
Yeah.
I don't mention, outside of this podcast, I don't talk about Jordan Peterson.
No.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's it, because I'd be fair play to this guy for, for certainly having heard of some people. Anyway. And I said, no. So I tried to basically say there's this writer for this Israeli paper called Haaretz, who my wife says I don't quite like, actually, and he's a sort of old school there, focused on things like class and material stuff, and is quite critical of the excesses of the identitarian left. And I basically said to him, do you ever read Haaretz, this like Leftwing newspaper? He went, if I ever saw Haaretz, I'd take a shit on it or something like that. Turns out this guy in some kind of militia who goes around patrolling like the Egyptian border to see if any asylum seekers are trying to sneak in, and he shoots them. Like, and his buddies go around with the rifles and stuff. And he had a nose ring. He had this big hipster beard and all this kind of stuff.
Is he undercover?
Well, exactly. Exactly. And then he put some kind of group. It's really weird. It's like, well, look, if this guy was in London, I'm sure in, so like Sydney or Melbourne or wherever, you think, okay, yeah, you could definitely tell this guy's politics, probably.
Yeah, he's a barista.
And he would think,
and he supports,
you definitely might be this guy, or use flat white and be like,
yeah.
Exactly. So Israel is a strange place because you do have liberalism in many ways, and but it coincides with sort of nationalistic and militaristic policies, especially in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect them. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that you can definitely have a sort of I don't think as people like, say, Morris Glasman or John Gray, to quote sort of two more linty or post-liberal writers in the UK, actually. So Morris Glasman is associated with Blue Labour, and John Gray is a well-known philosopher. And these two guys and people like them, like Louise Perry, for example, who we've had on the show in the past, they would really sort of lament that actually liberal values are not really compatible with a healthy, happy society and economy and nation. And it's really sort of difficult to reconcile these things. And I'm not quite sure, actually. I think you can have a sort of successful left. I think you can have a successful economy and national identity and national cohesion with, and indeed, family values and above replacement fertility rate and all the rest of it. And actually, you can have sort of individual liberalism as well, I think. So, even though it's strange to me how far certain sections of the left have moved in just 5 or 10 years. The way, people and attitudes that would have comfortably been considered on the left 5 or 10 years ago are now considered are quite outside that scope in some ways. I think that's a bit, weird and inappropriate. But I think I can definitely consider myself on the left, both as a sort of socialist and also as a bit of a liberal as well.
A lot of people we talk to would class themselves as old school leftists. And, one thing we do hear a lot is that the left has moved to the extreme and is unrecognizable to them. So, what's your take on this realignment of the left and the right for that matter? And do you think these labels left and right mean anything anymore?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say if they do mean anything, because someone says the left, well, what does that mean, right? I think for a lot of, especially younger people, and I mean, under 30, for example, under 25, they would think the left means stuff to do with the environment, to do with asylum seekers and immigration, to do with LGBT rights, especially the T, to do with Israel, Palestine. I remember back when I used to work in universities, and I used to ask my students, who's more of a socialist, like Jeremy Corbyn or Ed Miliband, the Labour leader before Jeremy Corbyn? And everyone would say Jeremy Corbyn. And I'd say, well, why is Jeremy Corbyn more of a socialist? And they would say things like, he's against nuclear weapons, or, he's really pro-Palestine and stuff like that. He doesn't like the US and NATO. I said, okay, fine, but does that make him a socialist? These are liberal values, actually, rather than socialist values in many ways. So, yeah, I definitely think left and right is becoming sort of increasingly inadequate to describe people's politics. I think it's very interesting to see the attempted shift. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the Liberal Party in Australia, but definitely with the Republicans in the US and with the Labour Party in the UK, they've had this attempted realignment, maybe say with Boris Johnson, in 2019 or Trump in 2016, to move away, to get this sort of working class vote, right? The more sort of economically left-wing vote, but maybe more culturally right-wing. And they're undermined by this, because obviously so many of their MPs, like their politicians and their media outriders, don't believe in it, right? They definitely do not believe in higher taxes and higher levels of government spending and more regulation, etc. So it's awkward, because in some ways they're trying to pitch that this new constituency of sort of, economically left-wing and socially conservative boxes, but they definitely do not believe in the economic side of it. So, they're limited in what they can do there. And maybe it's, the same with the Liberals in Australia, actually, some of them might think, okay, we can maybe have, it might be good for us to try and branch out more into traditional Labour supporters and by appealing to economic values, but being, more ideal culture. But actually, if you don't believe in that stuff, it's hard to do it. It's hard to do. I mean, actually, it seems like the problem that the British Labour Party seem to be having until recently, because many people like Maurice Glasgow, like myself, have been saying, most people in the UK are left-wing economically, but they are repelled, including Black and Asian people and young people and gay people and all the rest of it. They are repelled by some of the excesses of identitarianism. So, move away from that. And some people would say, but Labour can't do this, right? Labour can't pretend to be patriotic and pretend to be anti-immigrant, because they're clearly not, the actual politicians are not, and the think tanks are not, and the journalists are not. But I don't know. I think Keir Starmer's doing that pretty well. Like, sometimes I think he's going overboard, actually. I mean, you never see Keir Starmer or a Union Jack flag behind him, or from that of language about how he's going to lock up public weed smokers and force them to do community service and this kind of stuff. Okay, fair enough. And I think as I was saying before, I don't think that certain institutions of the left, such as the UK Labour Party, are so far gone that they are, beyond redemption and can't be sort of brought back to the old school left. And I think sort of Keir Starmer has shown that, actually. I think if he was in office with a majority, things like gender recognition, right? So the Conservatives a few years ago under Theresa May were going to introduce self-ID in the whole of the UK, right? So the thing that Rishi Sunak recently blocked being introduced in Scotland. The then Culture Secretary, his name I've forgotten, unfortunately, but so what we're saying is, so a woman who's very much on the sort of cultural left of the Conservative Party wanted to introduce self-ID to the UK, so people would not have to undergo any sort of hormone treatment or anything like that to change their gender. And Theresa May, government was going to introduce this to Conservatives. I don't think there's any chance of that happening now under a Keir Starmer government, for example. So it's interesting, because I think ultimately it comes down to money and tax and investment and who's going to pay for stuff, right? I think when issues like that are less pressing, then maybe these old ideas of left and right dissipate and don't mean so much anymore. But when these issues come back and really hard choices have to be made about, how high should taxes be, what size or what role should the government have in the economy, then I think ultimately it does come down to these things, and left and right do mean things again. Because as I was saying earlier, it's ultimately very hard for conservatives, political conservatives, to embrace, left-wing economics, and that I think really does limit any kind of realignment. And I think it does mean that left and right still need something.
I'm loving this discussion about the left. It's sort of like your deadbeat brother who is on heroin and steals your stuff and sells it. You love him, but he's hurting you daily. So I don't. Well, we can come at it from another angle, perhaps, David, because I really want to get all of this out. So, because being on the left used to actually be quite cool. You were sort of a rebel, well, for a little while there anyway. Maybe you can tell me when you think that might be, but you seem to be like a rebel who cared about the little guy and the environment, but you had really good taste in music and films also, And I know it's a cheap shot, but today the left seems, just particularly the left seems very, very uncool. Is this a problem?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's very hard to, obviously it's hard to quantify that kind of thing, right? How much does the left put people on? Not necessarily because of policies or anything, but just because of image and aesthetics. And definitely me personally, a lot of my problems with the left, sometimes I think, I actually agree with a lot of what this person might be saying. I'm much closer to this person than I am someone else. And yeah, I really hate you. I mean, so often it's so superficial, right? And it's it is just because of the way you act, the way someone acts on social media. Maybe because of the way that they're dressed or the ridiculous hairstyle or something. I don't know. So often it is superficial and it is just down to aesthetics. And somebody with whom I actually have a lot in common politically, I might be sort of repelled by. And yet someone who I don't really agree with on politics, but at least I'd want to have a pint with them. I wouldn't actually mind hanging out with them, even if we might disagree on politics. So for me personally, I think that's the thing. And actually, if you look at what, focus groups, for example, say about people like Jeremy Corbyn, they say, they do talk about aesthetics. I mean, actually, Corbyn's people were very good at completely reshaping his, if not how he was perceived, but certainly how he presented himself. They made sure he always wore a sharp suit. They made sure his beard was trimmed for the first time in 40 years. So, they really tried, because they knew that many people who might vote for Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, were actually put off by his scruffiness and by his, student, old school sort of student who never grew up aesthetics. So yeah, I think these things can be important. I think they really can be important. I mean, if you look at Boris Johnson, obviously Boris Johnson, crucial to his success, is very particular aesthetic, which allowed him to get around the fact that he's from this very privileged background. Because if you think, okay, yeah, sure, but look at the way he dresses, look at the way he acts, look at his whole shtick. He's this lovable buffoon, right? Rather than this sort of stone cold, like operator that he really is. In terms of
it came across a little bit like, it's a very old movie now, but there's a Dudley Moore movie called Arthur, where he's like a rich, like childish, scruffy,
Yeah, I think similar haircut to Boris Johnson as well. Matt,
that's what I was thinking. They have both got mad hair.
Yeah, definitely. That's it. I mean, you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if the young Boris Johnson saw that, or youngish Boris Johnson saw it and thought, "By God, this is how I'll, have my public image to get away from the fact that from this quite elite background." So yeah, I think these things do matter. If you look at sort of more, people like Barack Obama, for example, I think very important to his success was that he was, a cool customer. He was suave. He was sophisticated. He dressed well, and he drank wine, but also he liked basketball and liked hip hop and that kind of stuff. He had an hinterland. I think it's important. I think one of the, as you just going back to what you're saying before about being cool, I think a lot of left-wing activists now, a lot of left-wing journalists don't seem to have much of a hinterland. They don't seem to have many cultural interests apart from politics, which I think is a huge problem, because obviously most people, just to understate it, most people are not like that. Most people do not care about politics. including people who, one should argue should really care about politics because their lives are crap and actually they care more about politics, or maybe if, politics cares about them kind of thing, they should take more of an interest. But, people are put off if you just seem to be this obsessive nerd who's just focused on politics. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, once said that Imagine by John Lennon was his favourite song. And just trying to think, come on, is it really? Yeah, because it just shows that guy who's heard no songs, maybe. So he just thinks fucking little person, right? Like, I'll say Imagine by John Lennon.
That song, to quote the Fast Show, rubbish.
And this is Jeremy Corbyn, isn't it? It's a man who apparently he's not a teetotaler, but to the bar that he is. It says a lot about him. He does apparently have a glass of wine every now and then, but he maintains the image of being a teetotaler. I think, what the hell are you doing? You just show that you have some character, show that there's something to you, other than just, what about the Palestinians, or what about the poor? Okay, yeah, what about them? Yeah, but how are you going to help them if you put people off because you seem like this massive weirdo? Yeah, I think it shouldn't be important, to not seem like a nerd and not seem like a weirdo. But unfortunately, it is in modern politics. I think you've got to present yourself in a certain way. And Keir Starmer, for example, Keir Starmer is interesting, the current Labour leader, because certainly his public image seems pretty boring and staid and stuff. Apparently, in real life, he's a bit of a laugh. He likes a drink. He's a genuine fan of football and stuff, and he, goes to see Arsenal, or he used to anyway, quite regularly. So he does have this hinterland, but he seems like a bit of a square. But I think that's okay because he doesn't seem like a weirdo. He seems maybe a bit boring, but in a sort of generic way, he seems like a sort of typical, like, normie kind of person. So he's not a weirdo. He's just not that interesting. I think that's okay for him. But generally, I think it's so important that you don't put people off by being seen as an absolute weirdo.
Well, maybe, David, we could pivot towards your book now, The Identity Myth. Can you tell us how that project came about and who is it for?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of noticed for years, really, that, in the UK and I imagine Australia as well, that the left, however you want to constitute it, was less diverse than the population itself. Right? It certainly was much more middle class and better educated, whiter than the population itself. And very often the way activists, journalists, even some academics would talk about, say, the working class, or Black people, or Muslims, or trans people, or whatever, it was just almost this idealized, icon of something that had no bearing to how actual real people lived and felt and what they believed in. And so really, I thought, when it comes to things like class and race and gender and sexuality, often there are images and stereotypes put about by both left and right. A big thing in the UK recently has been the right, and even the US as well, the right talking about the white working class, where everyone who's white working class is assumed to be massively anti-immigration for time. And of course, that's not necessarily true. And certainly, as we see with things like race, the way many white people on the left talk about, say, African Americans or Black people in the UK makes it seem that they're all political radicals, when in many ways, couldn't be further from the truth. So the identity myth came about because I really wanted to write something that would try and correct some of these sort of stereotypes and myths and cliches, and say not only are specific groups much more complicated in terms of their culture and their politics than we might assume, but really trying to undermine cultural and political essentialism in the first place, to say, listen, people may have, because of the situation that they are in, right? So say you have a certain amount of wealth and you earn a certain amount of money. Okay, you're in a particular situation, that is true. And you have something else in common with other people in that situation. But it doesn't stem from that you therefore will believe in certain things and act in a certain way and have a certain kind of culture. And in fact, so often in political discourse and the media, the focus is on the culture. The focus is on, say, African-American culture and African-American identity, rather than the actual lives of, say, African-American people or the white working class or whoever.
Now, David, we don't have to spend too much time on this next question, but do you use the term woke or wokeness? I don't think I've heard you use that term. What kinds of things do we mean by these terms nowadays?
Yeah, that's it. So I'm quite try, Ricky, to be able to not use it, for that exact reason, because it's so ambiguous. And it can be, used and misused by various people for various things. And I definitely think there is such a thing as wokeness, absolutely. And I definitely think that lots of people want to be seen as it and want to be seen to be exhibiting it, right, deliberately. Not necessarily that they want to actually change anything or improve anyone else's life. I'm certainly not saying they want to inconvenience themselves in any way, but they definitely want to be associated with a certain thing. I mean, I think this is, in some ways, one of the worst things to happen to politics worldwide, at least in developed economies, is the development of social media. Because on the one hand, you have people who are not, who can't be asked to do anything, who definitely don't want to inconvenience themselves or lose out on anything, but they certainly want to exhibit and project a certain identity. And many people absolutely want to be seen as woke and to say woke things and to do woke things. And many other people are pissed off by that. They see it and they get angry. And I think that's a big problem. So yeah, I think for me, there's definitely this idea of wokeness because there's an incentive to always be sort of pushing the envelope on certain things, right? This might seem like a random anecdote, but I read a brilliant article about 10 years ago about football hipsterism, footballers in soccer, UK football. And this guy in this article was basically saying, I'm so sick and tired of football hipsters because they're always talking about like the more obscure players. And if there's like some new player come on the scene, like he's yesterday's news, what about this guy no one's ever heard of, And I think that's a big thing in politics now. And I think that's a key thing to do with wokeness, right? You're saying like, oh, we should reform the police, abolish the police. You're saying like, oh, we should have a generous immigration policy. Well, what is a fascist? So there's this desire to always have this one-upmanship, which I think is so much propelled by social media. It's so much propelled by an increase in higher education without commensurate jobs for their, all these newly minted master's degrees and PhDs and stuff like that, as I know all too well about. And so I think wokeness for me is this constant desire to, especially because so many people doing it are themselves white, they are middle class, they are not gay, etc. So they feel like, this constant need to sort of outdo each other and push the envelope and say ever more, provocative and controversial things. So for me, wokeness is not really about trying to change anything. It's not really about serious politics. It's not really about trying to address social injustice or historic injustice. It's really about the identity of the woke. It's about them saying, hey, don't think that I'm just like all these other middle-class heterosexual white guys. I'm woke. I believe it. Look at all that I've said. You could judge me by all these things I say on social media, not by my demographics. So yeah, for me, wokery, it's not really about social justice, whatever that word phrase even means. It's not really about trying to change anything. It's an expression of identity. In the same way, it's the modern equivalent of having a poster of Che Guevara on your, on your wall or something. It's the modern equivalent of sticking a drawing pin through your ear and, wearing like leather and going out and pogoing to the Sex Pistols. So that, those people weren't trying to change the world. It was an expression. It was a youth cultural phenomenon, right? And that's what woke is for me. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's not a political phenomenon.
That's interesting. Well, David, your book's got such, it's numbers driven. You've got a lot of great data in there. So this, this is another thing you can't really quantify maybe. But when I'm thinking about how to identify something woke, because people are always like, what is it? Define it. Is that person woke? I have a couple of markers, and I don't know what you think of this. Like, I've found that woke people are, generally, I've never met a good-humored woke person. So humorlessness seems to be like, I go, if they're humorless, then that's, you can use that to triangulate and look at their other stuff and say, oh yeah, okay, I think they might be woke, because we encounter this all the time. Like, where's the woke, or whatever you want to call it? I don't care what you want to call it. Where's the sitcoms? Where's the music? Where's the movies? Where's the movement? Where's the books? Where's the great books, that we're going to have that are left over from this incredible movement that we all stopped our lives for 5 years?
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. I think it's very different from campaigns or say, I don't know, like redistribution, socialism and trade unions, or black rights or gay rights, or even like the early stuff about the environment. It's different, yeah, because you can't necessarily, as you say, so yeah, that's even just talking about music and stuff, like music and films and stuff and TV. There used to be stuff like that we could identify as being left wing or liberal or progressive, but you can't identify like good woke films or music or TV shows, because by itself, it's too scared of itself, right? It's almost like, if you were trying to write a woke TV show, imagine being in the writer's room for that, and someone comes up with a line, and no matter how woke it is, somebody else would say, "Oh, but actually, couldn't that be doesn't that just reflect your privilege or whatever?" So there's constant fear and one-upmanship, etc. And actually, so my wife recently worked at the Leeds University in the UK, and she had these, young women in her seminar group, right? So between 18 and 21, some of them white, some of them, black or Asian, etc. Some of them from working class backgrounds, some obviously from very privileged backgrounds, some of them lesbian, whatever. And I think one of the tasks she asked them to do was to sort of, write a manifesto or something. And they were all so scared. Right? They were all so scared about saying or writing the wrong thing. And these are young, they definitely could be described as woke. I'm sure they describe themselves as woke. And they were also terrified about saying the wrong thing. And I think that's it, right? That's it, because they have to have this humorousness, because how dare you laugh when X is happening, when Y is suffering? How can you laugh about this?
When whatever genocide is happening,
Yeah, it's exactly, that's it. How can you laugh when someone's responding to me? That's literal fascism, whatever. It's because it stems from the fact that the people who are saying this are themselves not underprivileged. They don't have this sort of demographic armor or the phenotypic armor of, say, a poor black trans person. If you're a poor black trans person, you can say whatever you want, and the woke will go, okay, fair enough. Because none of them are those people. It's rare enough that they're just one of those things, right? Or black or trans. It's rare enough. So because they don't have that demographic armor, they don't feel they can be humorous. They don't feel that they can, that they can make light of the situation or have a joke, because they just worry about being attacked.
Now, I'm interested in your term left-wing hobbyist. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is the idea that one could sort of not participate, but one could sort of have an interest in the left as a hobby or pastime, rather than being something that you did, right? So if you think of, say, trade unionists historically, or any kind of rights activists, wherever their group, suffragettes looking for the vote for women, black civil rights activists, gay rights activists, you were in a particular group and you needed things to change, right? To be able to vote or earn money or not get beaten up or whatever it was. So you had skin in the game, right? You were it was very important to you that your cause succeeded. Actually, for various reasons, you had the development of people who didn't have skin in the game. Actually, they supported various movements through altruism, which, great, okay, that's commendable. But because they didn't have skin in the game, because it really wouldn't affect them too much, whatever happened, it was more of a hobby. It was more of a pastime. It wasn't really something that they needed to partake in. It was just something that they enjoyed from the sideline. So in the same way that you might support a certain sports team, or you might be really into a certain type of music, or enjoy going to see French cinema or whatever. It's more like a hobby or a pastime rather than something that was essential to your life.
Well, some of the causes that the people on the far left take up, like, fighting for Drag Queen Story Hour, or an obsession with toppling statues of sordid historical figures, or, religious like self-flagellation over colonization, just to name a few examples, it doesn't seem to make much of a material difference to the poor or marginalized people, or people you might be an ally for. Why do you think they're motivated to tackle these niche issues, like, rather than, say, volunteer at a soup kitchen or help out at a local orphanage?
Yeah, well, exactly. I think if you volunteer at a soup kitchen, who's going to know about that, right? If you volunteer at a soup kitchen, but it doesn't trend on Twitter, did you really do it? So that's almost like the answer to that is in the question, isn't it? It's because nobody would know. The whole purpose of this stuff is to do it publicly and to be seen to be doing it, and to put on the social media that you are doing it, right? So yeah, if you silently go about your life doing good things for people, what's the point in that if nobody knows about you? Because if you had for years actually worked in a, say, domestic violence charity for trans victims of domestic violence, or an immigration or asylum charity helping illegal immigrants. If you've done that silently for years and nobody knows about it, what's the point? And in fact, if you're like a middle class cishet white guy who does all that, well, as far as the world would consider you to be just another middle class cishet white guy, they wouldn't know about your years of solitary service helping people. So this is it. The whole point is to be seen to be doing something, to partake in this pastime and hobby. Exactly the same way that people who say support certain football team, they'll put it in their bio on social media. They want people to know about it because it's really important to them. They don't just want to sit by themselves or in a stadium or watching TV supporting their team. They want everyone to know that they support their team, because that's half the point. And it's the same with what I call left-wing hobbyists.
Well, would you include? I mean, it's low-hanging fruit, and who cares about Twitter? But at the same time, when you see 12 icons after someone's name, I mean, I don't have. I mean, well, ours is our podcast account, but still, I would balk at putting one flag or anything after the name of the thing. I'm like, it sends chills up my spine. So what do you think when someone contacts you or whatever, and they've just got everything, Ukraine, BLM, like even stuff you've never even seen before?
Yeah, exactly. It's sad. It's just normally when people are, say, in their teens, for example, they have this thing which is really important to project some kind of identity and individualism and stuff. And that's fine. That's a natural part of growing up. But people tend to sort of grow out of that, and they settle down and they get on with, and people actually do tend to settle down with various hobbies that they have, that they're interested in, and they don't necessarily always feel the need to project it as they get older and more comfortable with their life, themselves, and their relationship and their career, whatever. But for people who never get over that, who have almost constantly have this adolescent need to say, this is who I am, this is where I stand, this is the group that I'm part of. It's pretty sad, And very often I think it is because they lack this demographic armor that I was talking about before. They are just a random, ordinary, white middle class dude from somewhere. So they feel that's not sufficient. They've got to have something else. I actually read a piece recently. I mentioned this in the identity myth. Actually, I mentioned how it's some ways in some ways I think wokeness, if you like, identitarianism, it really has a bad effect on middle class white women in particular. Because, for example, I don't feel bad about being white or being heterosexual. No, I don't care. That's fine. I think for a lot of middle class white women, they do, because they think I'm not lesbian, or I'm not trans, or I'm not black, or whatever, and they actually feel bad about it. It affects their mental health. Again, not all of them, of course. The more woke ones do, and this is the problem, because they think it's just not enough to be a white woman anymore. You've got to be gay, you got to be, well, even to be a lesbian. This is the thing now, actually, if you're a lesbian, or you're trans exclusionary, you're a bigot if you're a lesbian, you won't sleep with trans women, that kind of thing. So I think there's just this need to have some kind of identity and to associate with a certain group, especially if your identity is just pretty boring and plain. And so you've got to project this online identity.
Yeah, well, it's increasingly hard for upper class or even middle class university educated millennials and Zoomers to obtain a job that's sort of commensurate with their degree, and it's difficult to afford a house or start a family. And now this may not be true for all young left-wing radicals, but do some of them embrace cancel culture and intersectionality and some of these niche kind of topics we've been talking about? Do they embrace those as a way to sort of exercise their power in a world where they don't have much economic power? I mean, is this just a disaffected class lashing out?
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that's a huge amount of it, 100%. Definitely. I think, if there were better paid or more jobs, more regular jobs in the media, in academia, in all kinds of areas where people think, they deserve a job and they've worked hard to achieve certain degrees to get this kind of job, and it's not there for them. And they turn to the internet and they turn to, abusing people online, and they turn to this kind of identitarian nonsense. Yep. There's actually a great line in the film The Lion King, which, they always go on about this because it's so appropriate. So Timon the meerkat says, when the world turns its back on you, you turn your back on the world. And I think that's what a lot of these people are doing. It's almost like, well, if I can't succeed in this, then at least I'm going to abuse J.K. Rowling or something. You know what I mean? It's basically sticking two fingers up to to society and to economy and say, well, actually, we're going to make it all about policing language, and we're going to make it all about who, will say the most sort of outright, who will publicly agree to these ridiculous creeds and shibboleths and stuff. And, we can make it about, okay, fine, I don't have this kind of career anymore, but I can definitely, subscribe to all this nonsense. I can definitely put all these things in my bio and stuff like that, I can have these flags and stuff. And then that gives me something at least. So, yeah, I definitely think this is a reaction to sort of downwardly mobile middle-class graduates, absolutely. Which is precisely why this, they are the main class or group of people who are the greatest proponents of this kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing that working class people. It's not the kind of thing that most Black people, for example, certainly not in Britain and America anyway, are actually behind. If you look at people, I've obviously mentioned at the start of this chat, recent ethnic minority conservative MPs in the UK. But if you look at Democrats in the US, like Eric Adams, the new mayor of New York, Lori Lightfoot, the outgoing mayor of Chicago, people like that, they reject this kind of politics. Absolutely, of course they do, because they know what their actual communities and people like them really believe in. They don't feel the need to go along with this kind of nonsense, precisely because they are Black, or they are, in Lori Lightfoot's case, Black and a lesbian. So she doesn't feel the need to go along with this nonsense.
Well, Laurie did ban white journalists from speaking at one point in her press conferences.
So she tried to play both sides, I think, and got burned by end. She
just put on her woke hat for a second and was like, "Oh, this might be good. This might work. What do you think?"
I think she tried it for a while, and then all these crazy red rising primates and all this kind of stuff. And she said, "Oh no, I tried something else," and then just got attacked from both sides in the end. I think if she, like whole politician, if she felt that it might be better for her politically to do certain things, then she would. But it's not actually who she is, if that makes sense. She doesn't actually, she would only do this for political benefit. Like I said, the old Joe Biden, the way Joe Biden says all kinds of crazy crap. What kind of
corn pop?
What kind of guy
what's the other one? You ain't black, corn pop. He speaks well. I think he's another mad thing he said. He said all sorts of stuff. The corn pop story is that's actually one of the greatest woke sketches ever, but they don't know it. That's an incredible thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's it. Someone like Joe Biden, who what he used to say and do back in the 80s and 90s, very, very different to the Joe Biden today. So that's it. I think definitely politicians being politicians, if they think they have leverage to be gained from going in certain directions, they will. But at least they're doing it for in some ways, I think. At least it's almost like because there's a payoff for them, they do something in exchange for something. Whereas I think with a lot of the people who don't really have anything to gain from that, apart from just some kind of sense of self, or some kind of sense of belonging to something, I think that's really pathetic and more than anything else.
So maybe with the identity myth, your book, could you maybe talk us through some of the different ways? Let's just pick out class, for instance, because this is something that comes up a lot, particularly, even Ricky and I engage in this. We talk about why doesn't the left care about class anymore? And I've heard some interesting critiques of what I just said. So, what other ways can we look at class in relation to your book?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting thing, isn't it? Because do we mean wealth the way Marx would understand it, right? So Karl Marx would say, you can earn a decent salary. But if you are forced to work for somebody else and don't earn sufficient property to live off, then you are proletariat and you are non-bourgeoisie. Or should we look at income and occupation the way there's more tradition you can see? Well, now, of course, people would say, in the UK, I'm not sure what the situation is in Australia, but definitely in the UK, people would say it's about housing, actually. Are you a private renter or do you own your own home? Because if you own your own home, whether you're a former coal miner in the northeast of England or a millionaire stockbroker in London, then actually that you are in the certain class. And if you rent privately, whether you are a university educated PhD or whether you are somebody in a really bad economic situation, then actually you are in a class together. Now, for me personally, whilst I can sort of see where they're coming from with this analysis of home ownership, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that private renters tend to be pretty woke. Not all the time, but now at least, private renters tend now to be very consistently left-wing, which they were not as recently as the 2010 election in the UK. I think there was no difference according to how people voted, according to home ownership. But now, yeah, normally homeowners now back to conservatives and private renters back to Labour. So I think, therefore, a lot of people on the left, who themselves, if we were going to judge class by the older metric, would be judge middle class. But they, if we're now going to judge it by being a private renter, they can say, oh, well, we're working class because we rent, you know. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation to be had around what should be the, I mean, it's a long going conversation, actually. What should be the basis of class? Should it be more material, i.e. wealth, home ownership, income, your job? Or actually, should it be something more cultural, you know, about your hobbies and your habits, etc.? It's interesting. I think it's the kind of thing that it differs by the state of the economy. You know, if you have like a booming economy and lots of jobs and social mobility and all that kind of stuff, then maybe actually say class is less about material things and maybe it is more about attitudes and culture and stuff like that. But I think in a situation like as we're in now, when, you know, certainly in the UK anyway, when the economy is not doing great, when obviously there is a massive shortage of housing, when there's downward social mobility amongst young people, then actually maybe old questions about class, about wealth and ownership and property become more important.
Yeah, it's interesting. In recent times, the Labour Party in the UK and other left-wing parties around the world have seemingly abandoned talking about class. And we've already touched on this. And sections of the right, particularly if we think of figures like Donald Trump, Boris Johnson and others have taken up that cause and are talking about issues relating to class. As someone who comes from the left and is interested in class, how do you talk about it without being labelled a far-right nationalist?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think definitely the left, since at least the left in the UK, at least since Tony Blair's time, has been saying, you know, the nation or hardworking people, hardworking families. It's very much avoided talking about class in any sense. So like, you know, Barack Obama and people like that definitely would avoid talking about class, or indeed they would deliberately say middle class. You know, in America, middle class is sort of code for working class. Having said that, more recently, people like Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have been more comfortable saying working class, which is interesting. But yeah, very often actually it's the right, be it Tucker Carlson or someone like Boris Johnson, you know, the political right anyway, and talk about working class and working class people, etc. And I think they can do that safely because a lot of people know they don't really mean it, you know, or they don't really want to actually redistribute income or wealth or power or anything like that. You know, they're just sort of using this as code for cultural conservatives, you know, as they see it. But of course, yeah. So basically, I mean, to answer your question, I think you can talk about class. Either you talk about class in a way about meaning, you know, wealth, control, power, opportunity, that kind of stuff, the way the left used to. The way people like Bernie Sanders can and even Joe Biden does sometimes, you know, when he's so condescending kind of thing. And I think I mentioned at the start of this chat, you know, a woman called Claire Ainsley, who works in Keir Starmer's office in the UK. And she wrote a book a few years ago called The New Working Class. And she does this. She says, look, the new working class is obviously multi-ethnic. It incorporates university graduates and people who didn't go to university, homeowners and renters, all this kind of stuff, you know, people with liberal opinions, people with more conservative opinions. And what unites them is the fact that they have to work for a living and they are constrained by their economic circumstances. They can't just do whatever they want. They can't go and live wherever they want, have whatever kind of lifestyle they want. Their kids have to struggle the way everybody else's kids have. You know, this is what class is. It's about power. It's about options. It's about control. This kind of stuff. And I think you can definitely talk about that. But it's difficult because then, yeah, people say of Claire Ainsley, oh, you know, she's some kind of right winger or something like that, or she's some kind of social conservative or something. Because, yeah, she doesn't. I think a huge problem is that many people on the left, and I assume this is the same in Australia as much as it is the UK, they think talking about, you know, class or community in this sense, and talking about like a group in this sense rather than individuals is somehow reactionary or something. I think there's definitely this what I call Kardashian Jenner socialism, where it's all about you living your best life, you know, and this is not socialism. This is not class. This is hyper liberalism actually, and it's got nothing to do with the left. But I think you definitely get people on the left who say, well, anytime you're talking about groups of people or a community of people, rather than just individuals and individual rights and individual self-expression and everyone being able to do whatever they want, then somehow that's, reactionary or it's right-wing in some ways. And of course it's not. And most people don't think that way. And I think, if you can sort of appeal over the head, if you can just go around these people, right? Because these people shout very loud and they are a very prominent place on social media and academia and in journalism, etc. Fine. But they are such a small minority of people. And so if you can just ignore them, if you can somehow ignore them, if you can get past them. And actually, Keir Starmer, to his credit, in the UK has done this. He snuck past them by pretending to be one of them when he was going for leadership. And now he is the leader. He's completely screwing them over. He's saying all these things about patriotism, law and order, and family values that they hate. But there's nothing they can do because he's already a leader. He's riding high in the polls. And the electorate at large really like what he's going to say. So that way you can talk about class. So like Bernie Sanders, I think Bernie Sanders has done it because he had these left-wing bona fides for decades anyway. So it was so hard for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US, who, actually disagrees with Bernie Sanders is much more centrist than him on all kinds of cultural issues. And he does talk about class. And it's very hard for anyone to say, oh, Bernie Sanders is some kind of fascist because it's just so ridiculous because he's got these left-wing bona fides. It's a real shame in the UK, actually, that we didn't have a guy called John McDonnell become the Labour leader instead of Jeremy Corbyn. So John McDonnell, originally from Liverpool like me, very left-wing, just like Corbyn, and indeed just like Corbyn has all these beliefs on Palestine and trans people or whatever, but he's very much more focused on class and material stuff, whereas Corbyn's always more focused on things like, race and gender and foreign policy and hating America and Israel and all that kind of stuff. So I think basically to talk about class successfully, you need to mean it. You need to actually want to change things and including inconveniencing people and taking away wealth from some people. Not like, Robin Hood, but I just mean like redistribution and inconveniencing people, having higher tax rates, etc. You need to mean it. You need to have bona fides. You need to be trusted on this issue. And if you are, and if you can sort of bypass the certain sections of the activist left, then you can do this successfully.
Now, we recently spoke with Norman Finkelstein, and I'd love to get your take on something he was talking about. He highlighted an interesting observation about the ever-increasing categories of identity that he's seeing in the US. And he was saying that if you believe that the roughly 13% of minorities that exist in the US should be represented in positions of power, like politics or in corporate boardrooms or C-suites, that this sort of incentivizes a kind of arms race towards becoming one of those 13%. So people are identifying in more niche categories. For example, a woman might identify as queer to give her a slight leg up over a regular woman, and this is something we're kind of seeing in Australia too, where more and more people are identifying as Indigenous Australians for some reason. Now, does Norman's idea ring true for you?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I think it depends. In some way, I'd say there's two things going on. I'd say, sure, there's that material thing, right? I mean, famous example is Elizabeth Warren, the US senator who
Pocahontas,
as Native American.
The Donald says.
Indeed, as exactly. So that's a very good example of that, right? So she's identified as Native American at some point in her career to get some kind of advantage. And me, actually, I'm more focused on when it doesn't even bring them any kind of material advantage, when they're doing it because they believe that there is either something wrong with not having some kind of, specific identity, or that they kind of fetishize and obsess over having some kind of specific niche identity. I mean, I think now, of course, because it's a very common thing for people young and I is to be non-binary and or autistic. The two very often go together if you from social media. And the thing about those two identities is it's impossible to disprove. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to dress differently. You don't have to act differently. You don't have to be inconvenienced in any way. If you're going to do a Rachel Dolezal or someone claiming to be black, big deal. You gotta live that for many years. You gotta change your appearance and all sorts. If you claim to be gay or lesbian, if you are gay or lesbian, you have to back it up by being, in a same-sex relationship. Trans, likewise, you gotta change your appearance. You gotta be trans. But if you're non-binary or autistic, you don't have to do anything. You just say that you are, right? And then you are. I'm not saying many people are, right? Many people genuinely are, of course. But my point is, with certain identities, the entrance, the barrier to entrance is so low, right? You don't have to inconvenience yourself at all. You don't have to change anything. And definitely, I think for a lot of people, young people especially, they really want to do that, not because they'll get any material benefit from it, but just because they think there's something wrong with being plain old, white, straight, cis, heterosexual man, male, and woman. Actually, there's something great about being disabled or about being non-binary or about being whatever. They think that it's something that's desirable in and of itself, even if it isn't anything to be gained from it. So I think Northern Finkelstein is interesting because definitely certain countries and certain areas where you do have, say, university places or government positions or jobs kept open for people in certain groups. Absolutely, in that case, you're definitely incentivized to claim to be a member of a certain group. But the thing is, lots of people would do it anyway, even if there was no material or economic incentive.
Well, David, you've been so generous with your time. I want to give you the final word. How do we sum up? It's been a wide-ranging discussion, but I think it's something about the left. I want to know if, because some of our listeners are, might be on the fence whether, which way they should go, what they should do. They want to know, is the left worth saving? What do you think?
Well, it depends. It depends what you want from life. I think it depends. Do you think how confident are you, that you can sort of survive and prosper without certain things that the left can provide, like a welfare safety net and stuff like this? How confident are you that if you had some kind of libertarian, tech bro paradise where it was everyone striving for themselves and stuff, how confident are you that you could survive on a completely open free market, where it was just down to your individual genius and talent and hard work? A lot of people are, and good luck to them if that ever happens. But I think for most people, we can't, we need protections of kinds. We need nation states, we need welfare states, we need communities, we need these kinds of things. And I think only the left can provide that, as bad as it can be, in many other ways. So I think if you want these kind of protections, if you want decent healthcare and housing and stuff and all that kind of thing, then the left is worth saving. And I think really, considering just how small and minuscule in many ways these identitarian people are, even if it doesn't seem that way, they seem very loud and influential. They already not. And if you leave the left and if you abandon the left, then you're abandoning these people. And I would just say, to adapt an old phrase, we are the many, they are the few. So I think stick with the left and try and reform it.
We have a final question that we ask all of our guests, and we'd like to know what you're reading right now.
Oh, good. So I'm just reading, I'm reading a book called The Northumbrians by this guy, Dan Jackson, which is written about Newcastle, England, Newcastle, Australia, unfortunately. It'd be funny if it was about Newcastle, Australia. But so it's about the northeast of England, and it's really great because for my new book, I'm hopefully going to be writing a book out next year about Liverpool, again, Liverpool, UK, about where I'm from originally. And it's basically about like history of Liverpool and culture. So I'm reading this book called Dan Jackson, The Northumbrians, which I definitely recommend to anyone who's interested in the history of Northeast England, in case anyone is.
I always love to hear people's recommendations. Always gives us a lot of ideas, a lot of inspiration. And, Dave, we need you to come back, David. There's so much more to talk about. So please say you'll come back.
I'm definitely.
Well, the book is called The Identity Myth, Why We Need to Embrace Our Differences to Beat Inequality, and we recommend everyone pick that up. David, how can people follow you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, David Swift 87. I'm not a prolific tweeter, but occasionally I'll tweet, stuff that I've written or whatever, so you can follow me on Twitter, David Swift 87.
Excellent.
Thanks, David.
Yes, right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.